Gather close, friends. Today I'm sharing a story that'll grab you by the throat and won't let go. A story of a mother's fierce love, a stranger's quiet mercy, and the kind of winter that can kill you or remake you. We're riding deep into the Old West, where blizzards howl like grieving wolves and the prairie swallows men whole. This is the place where one bad break, a snapped axle in the snow, can turn strangers into saviors, or into ghosts. Hit like if you're ready to feel the cold in your bones, and let me know in the comments, where are you tuning in from right now? The wind sliced down from the ridge like a razor, cutting through her worn wool dress and stinging her skin raw. Underfoot, the frozen earth snapped like brittle bones, too numb and bitter to remember the sun's touch. Thalia Hayes stood with her back to the endless prairie, facing nothing but cold emptiness. Her boots plunged ankle-deep into the half-thawed slush, the hem of her skirt crusted stiff with ice and grime. She clutched the baby tight against her chest, still warm for now, while the other two, no more than 5, gripped her skirts with small, bloodless fists. The wagon had shattered just beyond the frozen creek, one wheel splintered clean through. 3 days had passed without a soul riding by, not even a raven, just the relentless wind, the vast sky, and a silence heavy enough to choke on. Her hands bled freely. She'd tried prying the broken axle free alone, jabbing at the iced ruts with a splintered fence post while the children watched. Calpurnia, the oldest, had reached out to help, her mittened fingers shaking like a sick lamb's legs until the wood cracked in 2. Thalia dropped to her knees and let out a raw scream into the frozen air. No answer came. Behind her, the canvas cover flapped feebly like a dying breath. Their supplies were gone. The last scraps of food now rested in Elowyn's tiny belly, and Thalia's own milk was drying up fast. The infant gave a faint whimper, then fell silent, a quiet far worse than tears. The older ones had quit begging for food that morning. They simply sat, eyes enormous in hollow faces. Cornelius had set out east 8 days earlier, promising help. "Just 1 night, 2 at most," he'd said. "Hold on tight." But 8 days in a howling blizzard meant frozen bones. Thalia felt it deep in her chest. That awful, hollow stillness, as though the world had stopped keeping count of his footsteps. Any trail he might have taken lay buried. Any vow he'd made was dead. So they waited like lost children in the rotting shell of a wagon, in a field that no longer remembered its own name. She leaned down once more to check Elowyn's lips, still faintly pink, still drawing shallow breaths. She dabbed at the baby's forehead with the corner of her shawl, stiff now with dried milk and salt. Overhead the sky rolled in flat, iron-gray sheets, heavier than grief itself. No stars tonight. Not for a long while. Then, faint and almost unreal, a sound pierced the wind. Hooves. Distant. 2, maybe 4. Thalia's spine went rigid. She drew Elowyn closer and stepped forward into the open, planting herself between the children and whatever was coming. Fear coiled through her, not for wolves, not for cold, not even for death itself, but for men. Strangers. She'd lived long enough to know what hunger and despair could twist a man into. The hoofbeats grew louder. A horse burst from the tree line, legs black with creek mud, foam flecking the bit. The rider wore a heavy sheepskin-lined coat, hat pulled low over a face burned dark by sun and wind. He reined in hard when he saw her, eyes narrowing under the brim. Thalia said nothing. She would not beg. Her voice had turned to gravel days ago, and pride was the last thing she hadn't yet given to her children. The stranger drew a slow breath, swung down from the saddle, and his boots sank into the frost beside hers. "Ma'am," he said, voice low and gentle. She flinched. He lifted his hat slowly, revealing hair the color of ash mixed with snow. Not old, not yet, but his face carried the look of a man who'd watched too many things shatter. He took in the children, the baby, then her torn, bleeding hands. He looked like someone who knew breakage well. When he spoke again, his voice was firmer. "I won't let anybody hurt you." Elowyn whimpered once more. He took one careful step closer, then crouched. Close, but never touching the earth near them. "You need a fire. You need food. There's a line shack just down the ridge, not half a mile. I can carry the little one if you'll allow it." Thalia shook her head violently. "Don't touch them," she rasped, voice splintering like dry timber. "I won't," he answered, and the words carried weight. She felt it. A shift in the air. Not warm, not safe, but kinder than the cold that had been trying to kill them. He set his hat in the snow, shrugged out of his coat, and draped it gently over her shoulders without brushing her skin. "We'll go slow," he said. "But we can't stay out here another night." Behind her, Calpurnia let out a small, dry sob. Not loud, just the sound of something inside finally giving way. Thalia's knees nearly gave, but she caught herself. She tightened her hold on Elowyn, then gave one sharp nod. The cowboy rose, picked up his hat, and started walking without a backward glance. The snow lay deeper in the dips, crusted and cruel along the ridge. But he broke trail steadily, pausing every so often to check her progress. Thalia walked barefoot. Her boots had split open days before, but she felt nothing in her feet. Nothing anywhere. She carried Elowyn inside the shelter of the coat he'd given her. The older two trudged behind in silence, stumbling now and then, but never crying out. Their mother's quiet had taught them more than any words could. The shack appeared just as the wind changed direction. A crooked, weathered thing pressed against the bluff, as though dropped there by mistake and left to rot. Thin smoke curled from the chimney. Someone had been here. Maybe him. Maybe not. Thalia's heart hammered against her ribs, panic spiking fresh. But he turned to her, voice low and sure. "It's mine. I use it for winter graze. Ain't nobody inside but the fire." She nodded, lips cracked, eyes burning. He pushed the door open and stepped aside so she could enter first. The warmth struck her like a forgotten memory. A low fire crackled in the stone hearth. The air carried the scent of dry pine and something faintly sweet. Maybe dried apples, maybe jerked beef. Thalia stepped inside and eased Elowyn onto a folded wool blanket near the flames. The baby stirred, gave a soft whimper, then slipped back into sleep. The stranger eased the door shut behind them, unbuckled his rifle, and propped it against the rough log wall. He crossed to the hearth without hurry, feeding the flames with steady, sure hands, never staring too long, never rushing. Every move he made carried purpose, like he'd learned long ago that haste could cost more than time. Calpurnia stood stock still in the middle of the room, cheeks flushed raw from the cold. Thaddeus, right beside her, gazed up at the man as though he'd stepped straight out of one of those tall tales told around campfires. Half real, half legend. Thalia knelt beside them, gently stripping away their sodden coats and mittens, chafing their small, icy hands between her own until color crept back into the skin. The man spoke at last, voice low and even. "Got beans, salt pork, coffee if you reckon you can hold it down." She blinked hard, then gave a single nod. "Water?" He tipped his head toward a battered iron kettle already steaming softly by the fire. Snowmelt, brought to a boil. He asked nothing else. No questions about where she'd come from, what had happened to her man, or how long they'd been out there on the open flats fighting to stay alive. Instead, he turned to a sagging shelf and started putting a meal together. He set it all out on the scarred plank table. A tin of beans, a chunk of bacon, hardtack softened in hot water. The smell hit like a promise kept. The first real thing that wasn't despair. The children fell on it like they'd forgotten how to swallow properly, scooping food in wordless urgency, eyes glued to their plates. Thalia ate more slowly, not out of politeness, but because each bite felt impossible. Her whole body shook, not from fear anymore, but from the raw shock of heat spreading through her, food filling the hollow places, life creeping back into limbs she'd thought were already gone. He settled on a three-legged stool off to the side, watching the flames instead of them. Firelight played across the hard lines of his jaw, etching shadows that spoke more of hard years than mere age. His quiet wasn't the kind that concealed secrets. It was the quiet of a man who had nothing left to prove. When Elowen stirred again, he rose and nodded toward the spot by the hearth where blankets had been arranged into a makeshift cradle. "She'll be warm there," he said. "You can rest." Thalia gathered her daughter close and eased down beside the fire. She offered no thanks, not out loud. Her voice might have broken open something she wasn't ready to face. But she lifted her eyes to him, really looked, and he met her gaze, holding it steady just long enough for her to feel the truth. She was safe here. Later, after the children had drifted into exhausted sleep, he poured coffee into a dented tin cup and held it out. She took it in both hands. Their fingers brushed for a heartbeat, his warm, hers still cold. "Name's Gideon Rook," he said at last. She nodded, staring down into the dark liquid. "Thalia Hayes." He gave a small nod, as though the name already fit somewhere in his mind. Then he leaned back, stretching long legs toward the hearth. "This place ain't fancy, but it's dry and warm. Stay as long as you need." Her breath hitched, not from terror this time, but from the strange loosening inside her chest. She'd been holding herself together with nothing but scraps of will and stubborn silence, but something was shifting. Outside, the wind rose again in a low moan, yet the fire held steady, untroubled. Morning arrived in no hurry. Thin, pale light slipped through the chinks in the walls. Frost on the inside of the single small window caught it and turned it delicate like lace. Thalia woke first, eyes heavy but sharp, every muscle aching in a new way. Not the ache of breaking, but the deep, honest ache of having made it through when she'd been sure she wouldn't. Gideon was already moving, quiet as a man accustomed to solitude. He stepped outside to pour grain into a tin pan for the mule, breath fogging in the sharp air. His coat was back on. She watched him from the hearth. Elowen curled warm against her, Calpurnia and Thaddeus still bundled close to her legs under the blankets. He came back in without a word, wiped his hands on a rag, and tossed another split of wood onto the coals. The flames leaped up, bright and eager. The quiet between them wasn't uneasy. It carried weight, like something understood without being said. He broke it with a plain question. "How far were you aiming to go?" Thalia hesitated. "Fort Laramie. Cornelius figured there'd be work there." Gideon nodded, slow, like the answer fit the map in his head. "That's a good 80 miles from here." She didn't reply. There was no need. They both understood Cornelius wasn't coming back, whether he'd broken through thin river ice, vanished in a whiteout drift, or simply walked away from the life he'd promised. The end was the same. She was alone with 3 little ones, and winter pressing hard against her ribs. "Got pinned up on the ridge myself," he said after a beat. "Used to be a way station for cattle drives back when this stretch meant something to somebody. Just me now." She glanced at him. "Why stay?" He lifted one shoulder in a slow shrug, then leaned forward, elbows on knees. Reckon the rest of the world got too noisy. My brother lit out for St. Louis. Lightning took the barn one summer day. Caught both my folks inside. I stayed. Been here ever since. It was the first piece of himself he'd offered. She saw him clearer then. Not just a stranger handing out food and shelter, but a man hollowed out by loss, same as her, maybe deeper. Yet he asked for no sympathy, so she gave none. Instead, she said, "I taught school back in Kansas." Surprise flickered across his face, quick and gone. She saw it in the way his eyes sharpened. "Before the drought took the crops," she added. "Before it all fell apart." He nodded again, slower this time. His gaze drifted to the children, who were just beginning to stir under the blankets. Calpurnia woke first, scrubbing sleep from her eyes with small fists. Thaddeus muttered something soft and incoherent, burrowing deeper into the blankets like he could hide from the daylight. Elowen stayed quiet, tiny lips pursed in peaceful slumber. "You're tough as rawhide," Gideon said, not flattering her, just stating plain truth. Thalia didn't reply. She didn't need to. But the rigid set of her shoulders eased a fraction, enough that she could sit straight without flinching at shadows. By noon, she was standing again, moving on her own steam. Gideon showed her the right way to bank the fire so it burned steady, how to handle the heavy cast-iron skillet without shocking it brittle in the cold, how to divide the last of the dried beans so every meal stretched further. She went slow, deliberate. When the young ones asked for seconds, she portioned it out with calm certainty. Her voice had lost its rasp. It came low now, steady as iron. That afternoon she stepped out into the open. The wind had dropped to a murmur, and weak sunlight cracked through the clouds, spilling pale gold across the frozen flats. Snow sparkled on the upper limbs like scattered diamonds. A lone hawk wheeled slow along the ridge. Thalia stood rooted there a long time, drawing deep breaths, eyes fixed on the empty horizon. Gideon was splitting wood on the far side of the cabin, sleeves rolled to his elbows, forearms corded and scarred from years of hard work. Each swing landed clean. Sharp crack, wood parting like it knew better than to fight back. Thalia watched him a moment, then crossed the snow. "I can help," she said. He paused mid-swing, looked up. "You don't have to." "I want to." He studied her face for a beat, then gave a short nod and reached for a lighter axe leaning against the porch rail. "Split the dry stuff first. Start small." She took the handle without pause. Her hands still carried scabs, but she gripped hard. First swing glanced off. Second stuck fast. By the fourth, the log split straight down the grain with a satisfying pop. Gideon offered no words of praise. Just one firm nod, the kind that said you've earned your place here. Not out of charity, not because you owed him, but because you'd proved it. That night they ate hot food. The little cabin seemed to shrink, not from too many bodies, but from the simple nearness of breathing, firelight, shared quiet. Calpurnia laughed once, a bright, startling peal that caught them all off guard. Gideon's mouth curved in a rare, toothless smile. Thalia glanced down at Elowen, nestled in her lap, and whispered something too soft for anyone else to catch. Outside, the wind had swung around. For the first time, it didn't howl like a warning. The days found a pattern. Not easy. Not yet. But steady. Thalia rose before first light, stirred the coals back to life, measured coffee grounds with care so not a grain went to waste. She nursed Elowen with what little milk remained, mixing in warm broth to stretch it. Calpurnia and Thaddeus took up small tasks without complaint, sweeping the dirt floor with tied pine boughs, hauling snow inside to melt, stacking firewood. Hardship had stripped away much of their childish play, but in its place grew something tougher, a quiet, watchful strength born from seeing their mother refuse to break. Gideon gave them jobs they could handle. No more. He showed Thaddeus how to oil the squeaky door hinges, taught Calpurnia to check the snares he set along the timber edge. He never crowded them, never reached out to touch. Yet they began drifting closer anyway, asking questions, offering small smiles, laughing now and then. Thalia changed too. At first she still moved like someone waiting for the ground to give way beneath her. But the days kept coming. The wind gentled, and the work, grueling as it was, felt like solid earth under her boots at last. One evening she trudged back in, skirts heavy with crusted snow, cheeks pink from the bite of the air. She'd ranged farther than usual, scavenging branches a good mile down the draw. Gideon stood at the hearth, stirring a pot of beans that bubbled low and slow. She dropped the armload by the door and brushed snow from her sleeves. "There's a creek past the third rise," she said, "still running under the ice." He turned, one brow lifting. "You found moving water?" She nodded. "Not wide, but it's alive." He looked at her then, not as a woman caught in hardship, but as someone who could stand shoulder to shoulder. "I'll cut a trench. If it's clear, we can dam it up." Her lips parted in quiet surprise. She hadn't meant to lay out a plan, but the way he answered made it feel possible, real. Later, after the children slept, and the fire had burned down to embers, they sat together at the rough table. Thalia mended a rip in Calpurnia's dress with thread salvaged from the wrecked wagon. Gideon worked a cleaning rag along the barrel of his rifle in slow, methodical strokes. The only sounds were the soft pop of coals, the scrape of steel, the faint tug of needle through cloth. He spoke first, voice rough from long silence. "You didn't have to trust me." She paused mid-stitch, eyes on her work. "I didn't, not at first." He waited. "Why'd you stay?" he asked. She lifted her gaze, needle hovering. Her eyes weren't guarded anymore, though exhaustion still shadowed them. "Because you looked at them first," she said. "Not me. You looked at my children." He gave one slow nod. He added, almost like the memory had traveled a long way to reach him, "My ma always said a man's true measure shows in how he handles the little ones. She wasn't wrong." They let the quiet settle over them for a stretch of minutes, heavy but not uncomfortable. Come morning, Thalia opened her eyes to find a rough sled waiting just outside the door. Thin planks lashed tight with rawhide rope, runners hammered from an old gate hinge. Gideon must have worked it in the dark hours. For dragging firewood, hauling water, or maybe, when the drifts piled high again, for pulling children to safety. She traced the edge with her fingertips, eyes smarting with sudden heat. Neither of them mentioned it. A week slipped by, then another. The cabin came alive with small sounds. The children started humming sometimes, soft, off-key tunes that carried their own rough joy. Calpurnia told Gideon about the old hound she'd once had back home. He listened without interrupting, even when her voice cracked and tears came. Thaddeus asked to sit astride the mule one afternoon. Gideon handed him the reins and steadied the animal while the boy perched high, chest puffed with sudden pride. One evening, Thalia stepped outside alone and stared west into the blank distance. She whispered to the empty air, "We're still standing." Not everything ran smooth, though. Down in the settlement 6 miles along the ridge, somebody had taken note that the broken wagon never rolled in. Maybe a brother-in-law, maybe an unpaid marker, or maybe just one of those men who can't leave well enough alone. Trouble had caught their scent. Neither Thalia nor Gideon knew it yet. But the wind had turned. Gideon felt it deep in his marrow. The storm rolled in on a Wednesday, Sky gone the dull red of old pennies, wind keening like it carried ghosts. Gideon sensed it building before first light. The mule restless in its stall, air snapping sharp against the eaves. Weather that spooked horses and snapped fence rails like matchsticks. He was out early, checking his trap line, wading knee-deep through fresh powder when he spotted it. A single rider cutting south along the ridge, dark coat whipping behind like a raven's wing. Too distant to read a face. Too deliberate to be chance. By the time he pushed back through the door, his chest felt squeezed tight. Thalia looked up from tending the fire. Soot streaked across one cheek, ash smudged on her sleeve. "You saw something," she said. He nodded once. "One rider, coming hard, not just passing through." She didn't need to ask who. The blood left her face in a rush. She rose slow, spine stiffening like she was bracing for a hit. "It's Cornelius's brother," she said, flat as stone. "Phineas. Told us if we ever tried to run, he'd hunt us down." Gideon held still a heartbeat. Then he crossed the room, dropped to one knee, and lifted the floorboard where he kept his rifle hidden. Thalia watched him, voice barely above a breath. "He beat Cornelius more times than I can count. Broke his jaw when they were kids. Never set right. Said I was the one who made him weak. Said I stole what belonged to the family." Gideon met her eyes, calm as deep water. "He ain't getting close. Not today." She opened her mouth, shut it again. She wanted to believe him, wanted to lay her trust down somewhere solid. But she'd seen what happened when a man decided the world owed him blood. He pressed a small, well-used pistol into her palm, metal cold and heavy. "Only if there's no other way," he said. "I'll be out front." By dusk, the storm slammed full force. Snow drove sideways in stinging sheets. The sky turned ink black, rattling the walls. The children huddled close to the hearth, wrapped in every blanket they owned, while Thalia sat with the pistol cradled in her lap, knuckles bone white. Gideon waited on the porch, rifle balanced across his knees, breathing slow and even. The gale swallowed every sound. Only the wildest gusts carried hints of the world outside. Then a shadow took shape in the dark. A horse first, head lowered, plowing into the wind. Then the man swung down, boots hitting snow like he claimed every inch he touched. No pause. He marched straight for the cabin, dragging the fury of the storm in his wake like a hound on a leash. Gideon stepped off the porch into the drifts. "That's far enough," he called, voice cutting clean through the howl. The man halted, eyes narrowing. "You Gideon Rook?" Gideon gave no answer. He simply lifted the rifle a fraction, not aimed yet, but ready. "I come for what's mine," the man said, breath pluming white. "She's my brother's widow. Ain't got no business out here alone. Took his young'uns, took what was left on his claim." "She left with what belonged to her," Gideon said. "This ain't your affair." "It damn well is now." Phineas took one step closer, hand dropping to the knife at his belt. "You think she'll pick you? Some saddle tramp with a leaky shack and a broke-down mule?" "I'll drag her out by the hair if I got to." Gideon leveled the rifle. Phineas froze, reading the steady line in Gideon's eyes, the part that never wavered, never blinked. Inside the cabin, Thalia rose to her feet. She didn't wait for anyone to tell her it was safe, didn't call out for help. She crossed the room with the pistol tucked behind her skirt and shoved the door wide. "Get off this property, Phineas," she said, voice cutting like a blade. His head snapped toward her. "You got no call ordering me around. I buried your husband. You want to lie down beside him? Keep riding in here?" A beat of silence. Then a low, ugly laugh rolled out of him. You reckon I'm scared of you?" "No," she answered. "You're scared of what's true." She took one deliberate step forward into the swirling snow. "He wasn't coming back. He walked off and left us to freeze. I clawed his grave out of the dirt myself while Calpurnia cried for bread." "And you?" Her voice broke for a second, then steadied hard. "You never gave a damn about a single one of us." Gideon stayed silent, stayed rooted. He didn't have to say a word. Phineas stared down the dark eye of the rifle barrel leveled at his chest. For the first time, the wind seemed to hold its breath. He spat into the snow. "This ain't finished." He wheeled, swung up into the saddle, and vanished into the white roar of the storm. Thalia sagged against the doorframe, lungs working hard. Gideon reached her just before her knees buckled, steadying her with one strong arm. Inside, the fire had dropped to a steady glow, patient and unyielding. Dawn arrived wrapped in deep quiet, thick as wool. The world had hushed itself to listen. Snow lay soft and heavy on every branch, deep enough to wipe away Phineas's tracks like they'd never been. A faint sun tried to push through thin clouds, silver, cold, but real light all the same. It was morning, and that counted for something. Thalia stood at the window, one palm flat on the sill, staring at the empty line of trees. Her breath clouded the glass in slow puffs. Sleep hadn't come. The pistol rested on the table now, unloaded but within easy reach. Her fingers still tingled from gripping it so long. Gideon stepped in from the shed, brushing snow off his coat. His face was flushed from the cold, eyelashes rimed white. But the way he looked at her, like she was the only warm thing left in the world, cut through the chill. "You holding up?" he asked, voice gravel rough. She nodded slowly. "I'm done being scared." He peeled off his gloves and set them by the door. "You don't have to be anymore." Her gaze stayed on the snow outside. "He'll come back." Gideon didn't argue. "Then we'll be waiting." She turned to face him. "You don't owe us a thing." "I know." The silence that followed wasn't empty this time. It felt soft, alive, like something new drawing breath. That afternoon she worked beside him, mending the fence, shoveling drifts to uncover the posts, wrapping rails tight with wire and tar-soaked rope. Calpurnia stacked split wood in neat piles. Thaddeus hauled buckets from the creek. They moved like a ragged outfit, worn, patched, mismatched, but unbreakable. The labor filled their hands and kept their minds sharp. Each finished job pulled tomorrow a little nearer. One night, maybe a week after Phineas rode out, Gideon came in late, carrying the scent of campfire smoke and wet creek bank. He looked beat, but not beaten. "One of the traps got hit," he said. "Coyotes are pushing closer." Thalia set aside the shirt she was patching and stood. "We'll need more snares," he went on. "If we're going to see the rest of winter through, we, she echoed, tasting the word like it was new. He paused, then gave a single nod. The children slept curled together on the pallet near the hearth. Elowen stirred once, sighed, and settled. Outside, the wind had dropped to a whisper. Thalia stepped closer, reached up, and brushed a smudge of dirt from his collar. Her fingers stayed there a moment longer. "You still planning to pull out come spring?" he asked. She looked down. "I was." "And now?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took his calloused hand and guided it to her waist, right where a stubborn warmth still lived, where old hurt was starting to feel like it could heal. "I'm tired of running," she said. "Not if I don't have to." Gideon leaned in slow. No rush, no demand, just close enough to be honest. He rested his forehead against hers. "We'll put down roots here," he murmured, "if that's what you want." "I do." He kissed her then, not claiming, but asking, and she answered with everything she had left. Later, when the fire had burned to coals, and night wrapped thick around the cabin, she lay in the quiet shelter of his arms, the children's soft breathing close by. For the first time in years, tomorrow didn't feel like a threat. Spring came stubborn and slow. Snow gave way in fits and starts, not all at once, but piece by piece. First it dripped from the high branches, then retreated from the ridge, finally melting off the flat ground near the wrecked wagon, where mud still held the quiet ghosts of what they'd lost. Buds appeared shyly on the branches, hesitant green against the gray. The mule shed its heavy winter coat in ragged patches, rolling in the warming dirt like it knew spring was finally winning. Morning still bit with cold, but the air carried a different promise now. Thawing earth, damp pine, fresh-turned soil, like the land itself was waking up and remembering how to breathe. Thalia knelt in the soft mud beside Calpurnia, breaking ground for the first time since the deep freeze. Her hands, once cracked and shaking, moved sure and strong now, calloused from weeks of steady work. She pressed carrot seeds into the rows while Calpurnia followed, small fingers careful, brow furrowed in serious focus as she patted each one down. Gideon had raised a fence out back of the cabin, not high or forbidding, just solid enough to mark off what mattered. It wasn't built to shut the world out. It was there to hold something safe inside. A home. A promise drawn in cedar posts and wire, rooted in hope instead of dread. Inside, Thaddeus worked by the hearth, tending the iron pot where maple sap simmered down slow. He stirred with the wooden spoon Gideon had whittled for him, humming a tuneless little song, chest puffed with the quiet pride of being useful. Elowen, nearly crawling now, cooed and kicked from her blanket nest, cheeks flushed pink, belly round, eyes bright with that stubborn spark babies get when they've decided to live. Thalia caught Gideon watching the baby sometimes, his gaze distant and thoughtful, like he was sizing up a piece of his own heart he hadn't known was missing. He seldom spoke of the years before. She never pushed. But some afternoons he'd wander out to the ridge, near the old cattle path, turning a worn strip of leather or a rusted spur over in his fingers, as though memories had their own weight and needed holding. When he came back inside, he always brushed her shoulder lightly, gentle, grounding, before crossing the threshold. Their days weren't soft, but they were theirs. One evening, after the planting, the sugaring off, and the endless mending were done, Thalia stood at the new fence line, watching the sun bleed red and orange across the western sky. Gideon walked up quiet behind her, hand still dark with ash and sticky sap, and took his place at her side. "Found an old sawmill footing up the creek," he said. "Stone foundation's solid. We could raise something bigger there, proper roof, more room." "Room for the young'uns to stretch out," he added. She turned to him, searching his face. "You want to stay put?" "I want to belong somewhere," he answered. Thalia reached for his hand. "I've lived too long in other people's houses," she said, "always knowing I'd have to pull up stakes before anything took root." He didn't speak. He simply drew her close, her back against his chest, arms folding around her waist like they'd always known the shape. "I want to plant something that doesn't have to run," she whispered. He pressed a kiss to the crown of her head. "Then we'll build it here, for keeps." The wedding was simple and private. Just the 5 of them under the cottonwoods. No minister, no crowd. Gideon slipped a ring he'd carved from oak onto her finger. Vows were spoken low and steady, carried off by the breeze like seeds on the wind. Calpurnia cradled Elowen in her arms. Thaddeus held Gideon's hand tight, like he'd been waiting his whole short life to do it. Thalia wore a dress pieced together from whatever scraps she could salvage. Gideon had on his cleanest shirt, the one without holes. Next morning they buried the pistol out back of the cabin, not out of carelessness, but because they no longer needed it. Freedom had taken its place. The years coming wouldn't be flawless. Hard times would return. Empty bellies, bitter winters, losses that cut deep. But now there would be roots running deep, laughter echoing off the walls, small hands to hold, and a piece of ground that answered back. We made it. We're here. They built a porch out front, planted a young cottonwood nearby. Gideon carved a cradle for the child still waiting to come, and when the sun sank low, turning the sky to molten gold and flame, the cabin stood solid against the evening wind, full of living breath, warmth, and the soft, unguarded sound of a woman laughing in the circle of a man's arms. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Your presence means more than you know. If today's story awakened something inside you, don't let the trail end here. There are many more tales of courage, devotion, and faith waiting to be discovered. Subscribe, comment, share, and come back as we continue this unforgettable journey. Thank you, truly. Aviso legal barra disclaimer. All stories are intended solely for entertainment and may include fictionalized scenarios or dramatization derived from historical contexts. While AI assists in production, human creators supervise and adjust every piece to maintain sincerity, credibility, and emotional quality. We adhere entirely to platform regulations regarding AI content, ensuring no deepfakes or misleading portrayals. Licensed materials are used responsibly. Republishing, modifying, or extracting content without authorization is not allowed. We appreciate every viewer who respects originality and creative effort.